Hi and welcome back to Bike Speeds. This week we're going to service this lovely Cube Agree SL. There's quite a few issues with this. We're going to address the rear derailleur that wasn't set up correctly. We're going to address the steerer tube on this one that was too long for the spacers and the bearing that was fitted. We're going to update the firmware on the Sram Etap, bleed the rear brake, solve a future puncture that we found along the way, and also solve a range of problems from the way this bike was built. The first problem we had here was the headset and forks. Look at the amount of play in these front forks. This was like this from new. This bike hasn't done many rides. You can see there the play in that fork. Shocking really that a bike would be delivered with that movement in the headset there. We need to address that. You can also see here the rear brake is almost touching the handlebars, so we need to address that issue to make that safe. So we've got quite a lot going on with this bike just up at this front end alone. As you can see here, the bike has done next to no miles. I know from the customer that this bike has only done a few rides. We just need to really bring it back to being on point and correct as it should be when a bike is this new. So I'm going to start off by taking everything apart. So we'll get the wheels off, the front wheel off there, the back wheel off. We'll get all the components off the bike, and then we'll clean everything down and solve any problems we find along the way. So look at this. That cassette should never be that tight. I had to use a breaker bar to get that off. Ridiculously over tightened. Would never have been done up with a torque wrench. So we'll get that off, and when we put that back on, we'll torque that correctly. So off comes that cassette. You can see here how that has already began to build up debris and dirt. A little wash down of that as we're doing the service will bring that back to brand new condition. So that's good. Now I always take off the bottle cages on a service like this because it's very rare for the threads on those bolts that hold the accessories to the bike to be greased or lubricated from new. Some builders do it, but an awful lot don't. And obviously I've no way of knowing whether they've been done or not. So I'll take out all those accessory bolts and lubricate the threads before we put them back on. And you can see here, rear derailleur needs a clean up. It's not too bad. It's very dry dirt on there. A little bit of debris build up on the jockey wheels themselves. So we'll clean all that up and make sure that's correct when it goes back on the bike. Same with the front derailleur there. You can see dry dirt, so it hasn't had a lot of use. Just a little clean up on this one and lubrication to help it along its way. I'll take off the pedals because we're going to actually take out the chain set and wash that down as well. So we'll get this right apart, and also that will enable me to lubricate the pedal threads as well, which again, looking at the rest of the bike and the way it's put together, I just felt that it was important to take the entire bike apart with this one to make sure that everything was correct when it went back on the bike. So you can see there the chain set, that large ring, very little grease build up on that. You can see that that's not done many miles. It just needs a good clean down, but we will also lubricate it and get everything right before we put it back on the bike. I'm going to take out the brake pads to see that they are clean and okay. Obviously this has been through a bit of a ride, so we want to make sure everything is clean before we get the bike back on the road. So out come the brake pads, and I'm also going to split the rings on this chain set so that I can really clean between the rings and the pedal arm, really to get that nice before we put it back on the bike. I'm going to separate the jockey wheels from the main body of this rear derailleur. They need a clean up. Very little on this bike is going into the ultrasonic cleaner. We're just going to wash stuff down with the warm soapy water. I tend to favour not putting electronic derailleurs into the ultrasonic cleaner. I tend to always do those by hand. They are all watertight, but it just doesn't sit comfortably with me to do these through an ultrasonic cleaner, so I just wash these down with warm soapy water. Using one of our detailing brushes there. We do those in a pack of 5. We're using one of them there. Tend to do all this work with a detailing brush because you can get in between areas that you can't get to with a rag. They're just a great brush for cleaning that sort of thing down. Pedals, the derailleurs, the chain sets, everything I do with one of these detailing brushes. You'll have seen that in our other videos. We are going to pop in the cassette and the chain into our ultrasonic cleaner. So they've been through now. That agitates and moves all the dirt that is on that component. Great for that back area there where it's very hard to get in. And now I'm just going to rinse off the chain as well. So the cassette and the chain are like brand new, and I'll dry those off before we put them back on the bike. I'm just using actually a little bit of brake cleaner here on these jockey wheels. It's a way of getting them clean without getting anything impregnated into those bearing races that are on those. So they're all nice and clean, and now I can just pop this back together. There was a little bit of Loctite on the threads of these bolts that hold these together, these pivot bolts here. There was already its own form of Loctite that hadn't come off in any way, so I actually just put those back together without our normal process of putting Loctite on. You've got to remember these are a mechanical component, so I'm using our general purpose oil there on the pivot points on both the front and rear derailleur, and a little bit of our premium grease there on the spring, just to keep everything lubricated and nice as it goes back on the bike. Same with these axles. These are very prone to sticking in wheels, so you always want to make sure they're greased throughout the axle to make them stop from bonding into the axle of the wheel. And then I'm just using a little bit of copper grease on the bolts that hold the chain set together, and a little bit of general purpose grease where the plates meet the actual spindle of the arm itself there, with a little bit of general purpose grease. That way when I come to take them apart next time, they shouldn't have bonded together with dissimilar metals or corrosion or debris working in there. The grease will just allow that to slip apart next time. Torque those up, so you can see there the 4 bolts. I do those in opposites so that the torque on them is even. And now I'm going to clean up those brake pads. There's so little wear in those, very little wear. You can see there visually what difference it makes just to give those wire brush down. So to do those very regularly is a good process really with brake pads in terms of keeping them in the best of condition that you can. So you can see there the difference between the top and the bottom ones there. The bottom ones I've cleaned, the top ones are waiting to be done. Huge difference just in that cleaning them down process. So next up I need to address this movement in this headset. Initially I wanted to inspect to see what spaces we had, but you'll be absolutely staggered at this steerer tube given that this has come out of the factory or the workshop like this. When I put this tape around here, we're actually going to lower this, but look how badly that is finished off. I don't know who on earth sawed this down to fit the bike, but that is absolutely shocking. It's one of the worst I've ever seen. Look at it round this back edge, how rough that is. But you can see there I've put a bit of tape on there. It's about 2 mil down. I could have took these out of the bike, but it would have involved redoing the brake cables, so I actually elected to just file this down. It was only a couple of millimeters. It would unsettle the bike to take everything apart to get that into the vise to do it with our normal process. So I'm just going to file this down to that white tape. So we bring that down, you can see there that's sitting on the top there, nice and square. That will be a better edge finish. You're less likely to get fraying or damage to the carbon fiber that way. But I've also lowered it that couple of millimeters, which when I put it back together will enable us to pull that top cap into the bearing to take that pre-tension onto the bearing to the correct force, so that we've got no movement in those forks. This bike would have been quite unsettling if you were flying down a hill into a bend with the amount of movement on a rough road. It would have been a very tricky handling bike. So you can see there we've took that movement out of the bearing. I'm now quite happy with the way that sits and the way that feels, so that's now ready to be ridden as it is. Now I'm also going to address this rear brake. So I slackened off the adjuster. I'm going to pop our syringe into the front there. So this is DOT brake fluid, not the normal mineral oil Sram work on the DOT system. So we just slacken that rear bleed screw off, put in the special fit in there, and you can just see here working its way through that little bubble, and there are a few more there, just a few little bubbles in this system, but we've given a little bit of movement to that brake, a little bit further than necessary as you compress those bubbles within the solution within the pipe. So we've got those bubbles out, we've worked all those through, and now we're going to clean off the residue of DOT fluid from that bleed before we lock it off and put the cap back in. So you can see there, no residue whatsoever, nicely executed. The top, you always get a little bit of back pressure, so you have to be ready with your cleaning process. As I said, we use DOT fluid, which is very corrosive, and I'm always careful with it. So I clean that down with a towel, and then I spray that with brake cleaner, which we do sell on our website as well. We use all the aerosols and things you see in these videos, the cleaning brushes, the big softy brush that I'm about to use, the detailing brushes, all of those are available on our website. We're also going to use some vinyl stickers on this bike, which you'll see shortly. They're available on our website too. I hope you're enjoying this video. Please do click the subscribe button, do click us a like, and do drop us a comment. These videos, we enjoy making them for you. It's great to get your feedback in the comments about what you feel about the videos and what you're seeing and bikes you've worked on or own, ride, problems you've encountered from new. It's always interesting to see those comments, so do drop us a comment as well. So that's the wash down complete. I'm now using a microfiber towel to wash off all the soapy water and grease residues. Now, it was such a shame on this stay here. You can see that damage to the black detailing of the Cube logo there. This had mud guards on it and they've rubbed through that. So we're going to use one of our vinyl frame detailing stickers here. We do those in all numerous colours and shades, mattes and glosses, etc. I'm going to cut a shape out of the largest square and stick that over the damage. And that will protect that frame from the mud guard in the future and also cover that damage and take your eye away from it. And then on the other stay, I'm using one of our clear detailing stickers there so that we can still see the grey through, because we couldn't match that colour identically. But you can see there, huge difference to that, and that will be okay moving forwards. Next up, we're going to polish this frame. We're going to use our super resin polish made by Autoglyn. It's a lovely creamy polish, really works at getting debris out of a bike, out of a paint rather, and giving us that lovely gloss finish that we'll get and achieve with this. Again, we're using our microfiber towels. Again, all these products are available on our website. There's always a link for the shop in the description of every video. So we buff this off and it really makes this frame pop out. You can see there the gloss reflection beginning to show in the paint. This had a lovely gloss grey paint on this bike, quite a nice colour. And then I'm going to also ceramic spray this bike. This will absolutely make the water and the debris slip off of this bike for the first few rides. It makes a massive difference to the paint. You'll absolutely see the shine as we're polishing this. It really makes a huge difference to the polishing. Look at that headstock, the reflection there on the front forks. It's a lovely product to put on your bikes, and it's a lovely way of protecting that lovely paint that you've got on your bike from the weather and the elements. So now I'm going to wash down the wheel. This is a great way for me to feel around a wheel to figure out if there's any problems that maybe you can't always initially see. So by washing it down, I get a feel for the wheel. I get to know that all the spokes are at the correct tension, and I can see that this wheel, obviously with a little mileage it's done, is absolutely okay. I'm just going to sand down the disc rotor. You do get the scoring on those. It happens very quickly, so it's important to keep your servicing regime up on a disc rotor. Pop on that cassette, you can see how beautiful that is with the reflection. Torque that up, torque the center bolt on the rotor as well, just to make sure everything's at the correct torque. And then I can pop in the chain set. So we just put a little bit of grease on there to help it slide into the bearings and seat itself nicely. A spacer ring on there. And goes the crankset itself. Torque that up to the correct setting. That's always quite a fierce one. That's slightly more than the normal torquing. So we're just popping the pedals in, a little bit of copper grease in the threads. They were absolutely dry when they came off, so putting a little bit of grease on there of any description is always better than none. Although this has been ridden a few times, this is all essentially about building the bike properly so that it can be maintained in the future. On goes the front derailleur, the rear derailleur. We're really beginning to get this back together, and I'm just using a little bit of our copper grease in one of our syringes there on the frame before we put the accessory bolts back into the frame and the bottle cages back on the bike. So quite happy there now. That will stop those bonding in. These are stainless steel bolts, often into a aluminium fitting, so you can get dissimilar metal corrosion there, galvanic corrosion. That grease in there will just stop that happening to a certain degree. It's the same story with the toolbox, which has a very unique fitting. It was actually shaped to the frame, and I really like that detail on this bike. So once again, greasing the threads to make sure that it can be taken off again in the future. I also lubricate the threads on these pivots. They're very notorious for corrosion, these. The threads can absolutely seize solid in the caliper, and I put a little bit of white grease along the shaft itself, really to help that slide in and out of the pads and allow the pads to release freely. It is a gnat's whisker of grease on those, so it's never going to impregnate the pads themselves, but it can just stop that corrosion long term on a bike. It's good practice to do that. In goes those lovely greased axles into the wheels. They slide back into the threads. Everything there is now nice, and we can now pop on this lovely flat topped chain that Sram produce. This to me is one of the best chains on the market, purely from a design and aesthetic point of view. I love these flat top chains. And now we're just going to oil that. So I have a little microfiber towel under the rollers. As I slide that along, it rotates the rollers. We're using a nice thin oil in the top of those. So as I rotate the rollers, that will work into the rollers themselves, nicely oiling that chain before we deal with the Etap itself. So first of all, I'm going to charge up the batteries. So we just pop those in for a charge, each one. And you can see we also have a firmware update to the rear derailleur. So we're going to install that firmware update along the way with this service, so that I know that all the batteries are correct, firmware is all correct, everything's working correctly, and then I can be quite happy to present this bike back to the customer. So little firmware update there. But this was another thing that should have been set from factory or from the person that built the bike. The high screw on the rear derailleur was not set at all. It was nowhere near touching the derailleur for its limit. You can see the derailleur moving there. So we set that correctly. So we're now quite happy. And then the other thing, this has been straight out of the box put on the bike. The B screw was never adjusted for the size of cassette that was on the bike. So we adjusted the B screw as well. And now everything on this bike is now changing absolutely spot on. So the rear derailleur is correct. The front derailleur is now correct. Checking the brakes that they're all adjusted and centralized on the wheel itself and that they're working correctly, front and back, they're spot on. And while I was pulling the brake, I noticed this little piece of debris in the tire. So I'm going to pull that out, because every time this wheel is rotating, that will gradually work its way through the tire, and that is a puncture waiting to happen. So you can see there, that would have gone through the tire. That would have given this rider a puncture without doubt. So we've popped that out. We've even saved him a puncture, and he'll never know that without seeing this video. You can see here, brake levers are loose on the handlebars, so we've torqued those up correctly. We're torquing up the stem bolts there. Obviously we've had that apart, but even these calipers, they're loose as well. So we've torqued those up, front and rear were loose. Torqued up the axles to the correct specs, torqued up the mounts. We torqued the pedals as well. Obviously we took those off, but it's all about making sure it's rebuilt properly, unlike before. This saddle clamp here, loose. There was a lot on this bike that was quite loose. It never had a torque wrench on it. Saddle actually wasn't too bad on this one, but it was the seat post that was loose, and these brake calipers and the brake levers as well. So it was well worth the service from that point of view. So although this bike was almost brand new, the difference we made was quite astounding, really, given that this was a bike that had done very little mileage, was pretty new, and we've transformed it. We've made it handle better with the steering, we've saved a puncture on the rear, we've updated firmware, charged batteries. This bike is absolutely ready to ride the moment that it leaves the shop. And as you can see from these before and afters, we've made a massive difference to it. It is looking so nice. It was a pleasure to work on this bike. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. Please do like and subscribe. It makes all the difference. Thanks to the rider for lending us the bike, and we'll see you again very soon. Bye for now.